Good morning, Team Alabama. We are ready to read a little more in the Lottery Rose today. Please find it on your Chromebooks on page 129. Page 129, the Lottery Rose. Usually, he stepped to touch one or more of the roses that toppled on the long stems or to whisper goodbye and assure his friends that he'd be back soon. But today he felt discouraged and low-spirited. We're supposed to be friends, he thought, but it sure don't seem that way right now. He walked away without saying a word. Late in the afternoon, Georgie took Robin down to the banyan tree playhouse and onto the lake to feed the ducks. They stopped at the kitchen to ask Rosita for bread, and when they left the yard after fastening the big gate behind them, they waved to Mr. Collier, Georgie lifting Robin's hand and showing him how to wave. When they had thrown the last piece of bread to the ducks, Georgie persuaded Robin to sit beside him in the playhouse. He would have liked to read aloud to the little boy, but Robin would not sit still and listen to reading, and so Georgie tried, without very much hope, another method of teaching him. "See, I'm writing our names. Here," he said, taking paper and crayon from a niche between two of the tree's many trunks where he left them from one lesson to another. You might want to add niche to your vocab list. He printed their names in large, straggling letters and tried to get Robin's attention. Straggling might also be another good one, from page 129. "Now here are our names, Robin," he said, feeling almost sure of failure with his plan, but stubbornly refusing to give up. "This one is yours. When I point here, say your name. Say Robin." Robin had been sitting quietly as Georgie printed their names, and now suddenly he broke into boisterous laughter. Okay, add boisterous as well. Snatching the paper, crumpling it, and throwing it as far as he could, he pulled Georgie's hair and scratched his forehead, and then just as suddenly he returned to his quiet gentleness. Georgie bent to look into the clouded eyes. "What's the matter with you, Robin? Don't you want me to learn you to read? Don't you know that I was dumb once when I lived in another place, and now I read so many books that sister is surprised?" He took Robin's hand and held it to his cheek. "I don't want kids to call you dumb, Robin." They sat for a long time after that, looking out at the lake, which had begun to reflect the colors of sunset. There was a look of shadowy coolness on the surface that made Georgie long to throw his shirt aside and feel the water closing around his body now that there was no one except Robin to see the welts on his back. It wasn't possible, though. He had promised Mr. Collier that he'd never go into the lake alone and never would leave Robin by himself. "But if we had a boat, Robin," he dreamed aloud, "a nice flat old boat all our own, then we could go out there together. We could float around all afternoon and at night, and we could lay flat in it and look up at the stars, and the good old boat would rock us back and forth and back and forth." He made a rocking motion with his hands, and Robin took it up, swaying his body from side to side in the motion that Georgie's hand had made. "You understood that, didn't you, Robin? You knowed what I meant when I said back and forth just as well as anyone." He was pleased at any sign of understanding on Robin's part, and Mr. Collier had said, "We mustn't expect too much, Georgie. We must be glad of any strides that Robin is able to make, no matter how small they are." After a while, however, he grew uneasy as Robin's rocking motion continued, and he frowned as he watched the child, who seemed to have forgotten that Georgie sat beside him. "That's enough," he said. "That's enough to show me that you understand." Finally, he spoke with unaccustomed sharpness. "Stop it, Robin." And with that, the rocking motion stopped, and Robin looked up at him, seeming to wonder at his tone. A few minutes later, he heard the sound of old Eddie's truck coming down the road which led from the north end of the garden, and Georgie watched it approach, and the uncomfortable feeling he had known since old Eddie's angry words in the garden returned to make him feel worried and uncertain. He felt the loss of a friendship that had comforted him for many months. Me and you are artists, Georgie, old Eddie had told him once. Mrs. pointed that up to me a long time ago. We give the bushes fair, neat shapes. We bring out the best in a passel of flowers. And with the right fertilizer and the right amount of water, we scotch the weeds and kill the insects that are hurtful. So ain't she right? Ain't me and you artists same as if we held brushes in our hands? Okay, you might want to add the word scotch, as in scotch the weeds. Okay, and there was one other word that I thought you might want to add there too. Okay, any word that you feel like is something you don't know is one that you can definitely add. So don't feel shy about adding the words, just look them up and put the definition as well. Page 132. Georgie had liked that, except that he chose not to remember that the idea came from Mrs. Harper. It was pleasant, though, to think that his work in the garden was something like an artist's work, just as his book work with Mr. Collier was something like a writer's work. When the truck was within a short distance of the banyan tree, Georgie raised his hand timidly. Timidly might be a word that you might want to add to in greeting, kind of shyly, timidly. He was half afraid that old Eddie would ignore him as he had done earlier, and half afraid that he might stop and continue with the earlier scolding. But the old man waved, and seemingly friendly enough, and stopped his truck on the shoulder of the road, and he climbed down from the driver's side, grimacing at some of the pain in his legs. He walked up to the playhouse and leaned against one of the tree trunks. Grimacing means like kind of frowning, like he was hurt. He made a grimace on his face, or a facial indication that he was in pain. Thought that I'd best stop and tell you that I'm not mad, he said, looking over Georgie's head at the woods beyond. Georgie ducked his head in the gesture that he had almost given up lately. Sister Mary Angela didn't believe that a ducked head was an acceptable substitute for a polite word, but at that moment Georgie could think of no polite word. Old Eddie struck a match and held it to the bowl of his pipe, and sucking noisily at the stem. I oughtn't to have said I'd like to smack you, Georgie. Mrs. and me done some talking after you left this afternoon, and now I realize that you've been smacked too much already in your life. Still and all, you was hateful to her, and she's had too much grief in her life, like you've had too much smacking in yours. Georgie thought of the things that he had heard from Sister Mary Angela about Mrs. Harper's grief. Her boy got killed, didn't he? Georgie asked, knowing it well, but wanting to hear more about it from old Eddie. Her little boy and her man, old Eddie answered soberly, and Georgie felt a great curiosity to hear what old Eddie might tell him about Robin's brother. Did you like Paul? He asked after a while. Everybody liked Paul. He was bright and lively, about your age, I'd say, and maybe a little older. Mrs. used to come down here to this very spot with him, and they'd read together. Sometimes we'd hear 'em up in the garden, laughing over some story they both liked. Mrs. doted on that boy. It's the truth. Okay, add doted to your vocab list. Georgie felt a deep, aching jealousy growing inside him because Mrs. Harper had come down to the playhouse to read with Paul, because she would never, never come down here to read with Georgie. He felt guilty, too, because he was jealous of this boy. Mrs. Harper had loved this Paul, who had had everything but was now dead. Then a new thought occurred to him. She liked Paul better than Robin, didn't she? He asked. Old Eddie thought for a minute before he answered. There's different feelin's mixed up in lovin' kids, he said finally. Being proud of a child they know is going to shine to the world, and having folks say, that there's a fine young fellow, your boy, ain't he? Well, that's one kind of love. But knowing pity and at the same time holding up for the one that ain't ever going to shine, and looking straight at the world and saying, this here's my boy too. That's another kind of love. Maybe it's more unselfish to be proud of the second one. I don't rightly know. A blue heron waded majestically up towards the shore of the lake and stood some distance away. Staring at the three figures near the shore, Georgie and old Eddie watched it absently. Robin clapped his hands once and then resumed his look of quiet dreaming. Why don't you add majestically from page 134 also? After a while, old Eddie turned to go back to his truck. Well, you come over tomorrow, same as usual, Georgie. Me and you ought to finish trimming the hedge before we go on with the mowing, he said. Georgie waved as old Eddie drove away, and then he led Robin towards the house. He was glad when Mr. Collier came down to the gate and lifted the child in his arms. You have a tired boy with you this evening, haven't you, Georgie? Georgie nodded. He was conscious that Mrs. Harper was watching him from the patio, but he made no sign of recognition, hurrying away instead and taking a path far to the west of the house on his way back to the school. When he came to the rose bush, he stopped for a minute, touching the clustered leaves and stroking a half-open bud that looked at him sleepily in the deepening twilight. He felt an air of reproach in his friend, and he longed to set things right. Don't be mad, he said finally. We've got to be good to each other, and the way we always was before. Maybe someday. I thought when old Eddie talked about her that maybe someday. He left the sentence hanging, not knowing exactly what it was that he wanted to say. What's he thinking? Maybe someday what? Someday maybe he can like Mrs. Harper. Someday they can talk. Someday they can be friends. Someday he can respect her. What do you think? Someday what? Okay? That's the end of page 135. Have a great rest of your day, Team Alabama.